As a test prep provider, I am often fielding the question from families, which test should we take? Should we take the ACT or is the SAT a better fit? To begin with, I want to reassure you that all colleges that accept scores do accept either the ACT or the SAT. It truly is the student's preference. Now, because college admissions policies are always shifting, I would encourage you to look into any schools that you know are on your list and any particular programs, because if there are any limitations, it tends to be from very specific kinds of programs that you might be applying to. But by and large, if you're going general admission, you can take either the ACT or the SAT, and it makes no never mind to the college. Now, when you start to put the ACT and the SAT side by side, it can look confusing. Sometimes people will say, oh, they're exactly the same test, you can take either. And sometimes people will say, well, they're wildly different, and so you must choose wisely. I'm more in the latter camp. These are not exactly the same tests, even though on paper, what they test looks very similar. So let's start with what I think is the number one difference between the ACT and the SAT. Number one is tone. Most people go to timing first, and while it's true that the SAT generally has more time per question than the ACT, it's also true that the SAT has a much more complex tone. The way that they write their questions is far more convoluted, so students who struggle with reading comprehension, let's say, are going to struggle with a lot of the problems on the SAT, or it will take that extra time for them to understand the problems. And that's not just a reading specific issue, that also trickles down into the math that is very word-based on the SAT. The ACT, on the other hand, is fairly straightforward. We have very clear questions that generally pertain to pretty straightforward language in any passage that's being considered at any given time. And so maybe the extra time doesn't actually confer a benefit. As an adult who still goes and takes these exams, I can tell you they feel very different and the pacing feels very different, and not necessarily in the advantage of the SAT. Because the ACT is more clear-cut, I can get through it faster. So to me, considering the tone of the exams, much more complex and convoluted on the SAT side and fairly straightforward on the ACT side, is far more important than knowing how many minutes per question I get. So that is definitely my number one tip, to wrap your head around the tone of the two exams and figure out which one fits your student best. The second consideration you should take into account is the math. On paper, they cover the exact same range of topics, everything from arithmetic all the way up through pre-cal. That said, the SAT has a much more narrow but deep emphasis on algebraic understanding. If you're taking the SAT, you are going to be using algebra in a majority of questions. Are there geometry questions on the SAT? Absolutely, but by and large, the majority of questions really focus on students having a facility with algebra, reading word problems, translating them into equations and expressions, and solving, sometimes by hand, because on the SAT there are two math sections, in one of which you cannot use a calculator. On the other side, on the ACT, it's wide but shallow. While they have a more even distribution of topics, it's not as heavily weighted in the favor of algebra. It's wide. You have to have a confidence with a lot more math in order to achieve a score you're looking for. So they're two very different prospects. You do need to consider which way you would prefer to go. I will tell you a lot of the shortcuts, the back solving, things like that, do work on the ACT where they're not necessarily as applicable on the SAT anymore. They used to be, but now they're not in this new exam. So if you think you're a student who needs to rely on that, you don't feel comfortable or confident in math, one math section where you can have a calculator the entire way through may be the way to go, as opposed to the SAT's two sections, one of which you cannot use a calculator. Really depends on the student, and that's a conversation that, again, you should be having as you're considering which test to take. The third consideration is science versus reading. Now, this is not an exact equivalent because the ACT does have a reading section, but in ACT form, it is much more straightforward than the SAT's reading section. The ACT, however, has a science section. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about ACT science. ACT science does not require you to have a lot of outside knowledge of science in order to answer it. Instead, it's more of an open book test where you're asked to read charts and graphs and interpret a scientific scenario and answer questions. There may be one, at most two questions that require outside knowledge, but because we never know which branch of science those questions are going to come from, it's not really a factor. It doesn't generally impact your score unless you're well above a 32 every single time. Now, on the flip side, in the reading, on the SAT, you have some beefy passages. A lot of them are historically based, and a lot of them are very complex, true to the SAT's tone. So the question really becomes, do you prefer to sift through very dense language in the reading and figure out the answers to questions there? Or would you prefer to read charts and graphs and be very flexible with the science section, where you really are improvising based on what they're presenting you every single time? Very different challenges. Which one do you prefer? And just as a little side note, do know you will not be off the hook for science questions on the SAT. There are always a few graph-based questions that are sprinkled throughout the reading and the writing section on the SAT, which brings up sort of a sub-consideration, which is, are you okay shifting the skill you're using? Would you rather be in a pool where you're going, this is what I'm doing right now, and I'm only doing science in this one section? Or are you okay shifting gears for a few questions over in the reading and the writing, focusing on verbal skills and all of a sudden needing to read a data table or a chart? Every student is different. The answer to that question is different. And depending on what your answer is, you're going to be on a different side of the ACT or SAT line. The final consideration is the essay. And I want to start by saying you should always take the essay every single time you take the test. And the reason is the essay is optional for colleges to require it. If a college requires it, it's not optional for you. You have to take it. So I would hate for you to opt out, get an amazing score on either the ACT or SAT, and then apply to a school that requires the essay and you have to go back and repeat your amazing performance and get an essay score you're proud of. To me, it's always better to just sign up for it to cover your bases because you never know. Last minute, if you want to apply to a college and you don't have the prereqs you need, you can't apply there. And there's no penalty at a school that doesn't require the essay. They simply won't look at the score. So always sign up for it. Now, that said, when you put these two prompts side by side, they're very different. On the ACT side, we're asked to examine a topic that's probably something you're relatively familiar with. And if you're not, they explain it thoroughly enough. It's usually based on some sort of current event. And you're provided then with 3 different perspectives on that given topic. You are asked to write an essay where you express your perspective, but also weave in the 3 perspectives that have been provided to you. So if you agree with one, that's great. You can say why you agree. If you disagree with one, you explain why. And if you are sort of on board with half of one, but not on board with the other half, you can wrestle with that nuance as a part of your essay. On the SAT side, you are given a passage that is a persuasive essay. And within your essay, you are not asked to comment on whether or not you agree with that essay. You are instead asked to assess that essay. You have to go through and discuss how the author uses particular rhetorical devices or evidence and talk about how effective it is in creating a persuasive essay. For my money, I think the SAT essay is a little bit harder than the ACT essay. Most students can show up and write an essay on what they believe, Assessing how another author is persuasive and what they're using in order to be persuasive, to me, is a higher level skill. At the end of all of this, if you're still on the fence, really the best way to tell, it's not a fun and awesome thing to say, but it's to take practice tests. And when I say that, I don't mean going to take real exams. Okay, please hear me. You do not want to take a real exam cold or just to see how you're gonna do, because those test scores can end up on your college applications. Instead, take a free one that you can print out online and take at your kitchen table. Zero pressure, nothing hinges on it. You can just take it and see how you feel. The good news is if you've already taken a PSAT, you sort of have a sense of how the SAT is gonna go. So all you have to do is take an ACT. If you haven't taken a PSAT, you'll want to take both, but for heaven's sake, don't do them on the same day. Split them up, do them, a week and a half, 2 weeks apart, so that you have a little bit of rest. And then you can compare the scores and also compare your feelings about the exams and make the choice that's right for you. If you want access to 4 full-length free practice tests, 2 for the SAT, 2 for the ACT, you can click the button below and sign up for my 15 free test prep tools. There are other resources in there, but those full-length practice tests are a great place to get started to figure out which exam you would prefer to take. So go ahead, click the button below to sign up, and I'll see you in your inbox.